Yeah, um, whatever you would like.
Yeah.
I have typically set aside 2 hours for thesis differences. It's fine.
Wait,
Yeah.
anybody else to show up in person?
Fine.
Not expecting anyone. Mom and dad's not walking in.
No, they're on Zoom.
Okay.
So oh, so much.
Right. Yeah. Of course. Oh, 11 on the dot. Start. I'll wait another minute.
Doesn't matter to me.
Okay.
All the same.
Well, let's get it on with.
You want to stand in front of the
Sure.
room?
Is the microphone on?
I think so.
Okay. And you're recording?
I think so.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome to those of you in here in person and also those of you online. Thanks for attending. You're at the presentation or thesis defense of Kendra Gerstenberg. I'd like to say just a little bit about Kendra. First, I'll describe kind of the schedule for today. So I'll say a few words about Kendra. I'll introduce her and then she'll give a presentation for about 20 minutes or so, 20 to 25 minutes. And then we'll probably allow up to about, 25 more minutes of questions from the crowd, both online and here in person. So that will take us up to about noon or an hour from now. So that's kind of the schedule for today. So let's see, what can I tell you about Kendra? Let's see, Kendra, I approached her 2 years ago when she was finishing her bachelor's degree. I had her previously like 4 years ago in my intro to forest operations class. And I was looking for a grad student to work on this grant project that's funded by the Forest Service to do a survey of LTOs. I knew Kendra was a really good student in 250. She was a good writer. She was really well organized, kind of all the qualities as a master's advisor you would dream of having in a student. And so I thought she would be perfect for this project. And I said, do you have a job? And would you like to stay here and do a master's instead? And she said, me. And I said, yes, you. And so I convinced her, I twisted her arm into it. But speaking of her extreme organizational skills, which have been great to work with, she came to me the next day with a pros and cons list of doing the master's. So that gives you a little insight if you don't already know Kendra and her organizational skills. That speaks to her. This project was unique. It's funded by the Forest Service Station in Alabama to study loggers in California. I think that's cool about the project. It's not a typical master's project I've dealt with before, in the sense that there wasn't like a whole lot of field work and data collection out in the field. It was more office-based. But that doesn't mean that Kendra didn't learn a lot out of that and get a whole lot of experiences. And for those of you who know something about a postgraduate degree, it's not just about the thesis, it's about the professional development and other experiences you get in that degree. And Kendra certainly had a lot of experiences. She has aspirations to become a teacher. She got teaching experience. She taught a lab section to my Intro to Forest Operations class that she was once in. She also provided tutoring to other students. She took leadership roles 2 consecutive years with the logging sports team, including being president this year. She did some consulting work, helping out with the market research survey for an equipment manufacturer. And she went to a number of conferences, including going to the Associated California Loggers Conference 2 years in a row to present. And she also went to the Council of Forest Engineering meeting last year and presented there, which is an international conference. I feel like this is a long list and I'm probably leaving something out, but Kendra always says I never say I'm proud of her enough, and I'm just trying to say I'm really proud of what she's done and how she's gotten to this point. And it's been really fun to watch her grow and learn along the way. So with that said, I will turn it over to Kendra and she can tell you about her research work.
Thank you, Hunter. Very nice. Sweet. I'm glad you're proud. I'm proud of myself too. So those of you that don't know me, most of you I see are familiar. I am Kendra Gerstenberg, and I've been doing some research on an assessment of the California logging workforce, specifically targeting licensed timber operators. My advisors were Hunter Harrill, who you just saw, Erin Kelly, who's here in person, and then Mathew Smidt, who is online. I couldn't do this research without the support of the school, the United States Forest Service for funding this project, and Associated California Loggers. I'll talk about some more acknowledgements at the end. My button doesn't work. I'll have to use this one. Uh-oh. Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to share a little bit about California and logging if any of you aren't really sure what logging looks like in California. So I compiled a few quick facts that are a little bit applicable to this study. So 33% of California land is actually forested. There's a few different ownership types or groups I have here on this chart, which is an adaptation from a different research paper. But it's basically mixed between national forests, private non-corporate, private corporate, state, county, municipal, and some other smaller ownership groups. Previously, for the state of California, the U.S. Forest Service has presented some technical reports about the industry as a whole, kind of looking at employment, production, and then mill and exportation. And a lot of this kind of showed some potential of declining employment. And then for mechanization, just kind of move through the list. We'll talk about them a little bit more further in this research. Mechanization is the use of like mechanized equipment for limiting how many actual people are on the operations. So this is looking more at like those big pieces of equipment that you see out there on the landscape, like the grapple skidders, processors, feller bunchers. But California uses a mixed method still, which includes some manual logging, which you might think of someone with a chainsaw out there felling trees and processing it. Ooh, it's getting ahead of me. As well as this mechanized kind of logging that I just described. California is kind of particular because we have a lot of strict regulations through the California Forest Practice Rules that have good intentions in terms of making sure that we are sustainably logging and thinking about the wildlife, the land, the soil, and so forth. But it is pretty complicated, and it's a pretty thick booklet if you guys have ever seen it, with a lot of different things outlined in that pertaining to logging. So I'm going to move on to this research in particular. The purpose of this study is to determine the size, scale, and capabilities of the logging workforce here in California. I identified 3 different research objectives I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into, which included quantifying the number of crews that exist and their demographic diversity, determining workforce capacity and capabilities. For this study, capacity has a lot of different definitions, but I kind of looked at it through employment, equipment, and production for annual production and daily. And then the third bullet point research objective was to improve the understanding of workforce challenges, opinions, business outlook, visions for the future for these loggers. So I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper onto the personalities of these loggers and figure out what they think about the industry. So why does this matter? Why is this research even happening right now? Well, the data on the California logging workforce is severely lacking at this point. Other than those U.S. Forest Service technical reports I talked about that are pretty broad and a little bit vague at times, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics has kind of looked at forestry and employment and logging previously, but the last study particular to forestry and logging in California was from 1998. So I don't know about you guys, but that seems a little bit outdated. Currently, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics lumps in forestry with agriculture and construction. So you don't really get to look at forestry in and of itself. Additionally, like I kind of mentioned with the research objective 2, the capacity and capabilities of the logging workforce are unknown. So we don't know exactly what these loggers can be doing and what they are doing. I also wanted to present an opportunity for loggers' voice to be heard, so they could potentially contribute in some discussion or policy decision-making that might come from this research. But all in all, big picture, Gosh, it keeps jumping ahead. Big picture is that I wanted to provide insight onto whether or not this workforce is able to keep up with demands placed on them by forest managers. This can come through management objectives, mill capacity, or even consumer demand. So what did I actually do? For my methods in terms of data collection and analysis, I pinpointed who I wanted to look at, which was the licensed timber operators. This was a pretty decent population for me to focus on because CalTrees has a database with CAL FIRE in terms of who the LTOs are at a certain time. Includes their names, their license numbers, and some information such as mailing addresses. So I figured that database would be perfect. These LTOs are people in California that are allowed to harvest timber. And so it's not really for everyone that they can harvest timber, it's specific to these people. So I thought, perfect, let's go with it. So I created a survey tool and an interview tool. I'll start talking about the survey. It had a few sections, including employment, equipment, production, their outlook, views, opinions, and such. And then I ended with demographics. And so I collected these surveys from LTOs through a few different methods. I originally collected some emails from Associated California loggers. They had a few logger email database that I could pull off of. And then I was able to set up an online version of the survey through Qualtrics, which is a survey instrument tool. And then I made a hard copy for if anyone wanted to do it in person. So I went about and I emailed everyone I had email addresses for with the survey, asking them to please complete it. I went to a few different logging conferences, some that Hunter mentioned, additional ones including the Sierra Cascade Logging Conference and the Redwood Region Logging Conference early last year. So it started in January, and then I kept going, and I started making phone calls over the summer. And there are 894 LTOs. So I made a bunch of phone calls. And it was kind of fun to talk to these loggers, sometimes not so fun. But generally, I was able to wrap up my survey collection in September, at the end of September of last year. Interviews were optional for LTOs if they wanted to talk a little bit more about controversial subjects, such as compensation, insurance, specifics on why they may or may not want to work with the federal government, as well as outlining their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in a SWOT analysis, which is pretty open-ended. So once I had all the data collected, quit jumping. I threw the survey data into SPSS, statistical package for the social sciences. And I looked through descriptive statistics. So I wanted to see if anything kind of stood out. If there's anything in particular that I'm like, that's weird. Let me look at that a little bit further. And when I was able to identify these different hypotheses I wanted to create, I went ahead and created them and tested them with specific testing compared to what I was looking at in the variables that were included. In terms of the interview, I had some ideas on some anticipated trends. Like some questions were a little bit yes and no with some further detailed answers if they wanted to provide it. So I outlined what anticipated trends I was expecting. And then after that, because this research is so exploratory, I went ahead and used emergent coding, which is basically saying like what topics are several LTOs talking about, and highlighting them, color-coded. Like Hunter said, I'm organized, so that was pretty fun. And then I was able to go through and make sure that when I was going over them 2 or 3 times, I was able to see if I was coming up with the same codes or maybe if some other codes were presenting themselves instead. Yeah. So that was the methods. Now I'm going to start talking about the actual results. For the survey tool in particular, I had 220 loggers that completed at least 18% of the survey, which I concluded was a cutoff because it stopped asking like generic questions like, what's your LTO license, that I totally could have pulled from the database, and started talking a little bit more about their employment and who they have as employees. So I had 220 respondents, which was around 24.6% response rate for the 894 LTOs in total on the list. And you might look at that and be like, oh, Kendra, that's kind of low. But actually for loggers, this is a really good response rate. Other studies have response rates that are generally between 20 and 30%, and they're all happy about that. So I'm happy about my response rate too. In terms of the interview, I was able to complete 9 interviews. These kind of range from about 30 minutes to 2 hours. So they're a little bit more intensive than the survey. And my response rate, I compared it to my survey respondents. So if I compared it to all LTOs, it would have been like disappointingly small. But about 4% of the survey participants ended up going through with the interview with me as well. And most of this was happening right after the survey. I said, hey, do you want to do the interview? And they just followed right in. So that was really fun. So time to dive into the actual results here. Take a sip of water. I'll start with the demographics of these LTOs. So these licensed timber operators were largely male and white. It was kind of about like 90% so that were male and that were white individuals. There were some diversity in terms of gender and race, but majority was there. In terms of age, LTOs range between 20 years old and 80 years old. The 80-year-old ones, I was a little bit curious why they were still in it, but they were passionate about the work, so that was encouraging to see. On average, LTOs were around 52 years of age. So LTOs can have different license types depending on what kind of work they want to do. Licensees with the A license basically have very limited restrictions, so they can do mostly whatever they want, of course, following the California Forest Practice Rules and timber harvest plans. B license holders are more restricted. They kind of stick to Christmas trees and firewood sales. And then these C loggers can only work on their own land, so they're very limited. They can't really be selling anything like the other two have those capabilities. In terms of education for these LTOs, they were pretty well educated. I'd say most of them had at least a high school diploma, or they had a bachelor's degree, which was really interesting to see. And on average, they kind of spent between 3 and 66 years in the industry, averaging around 29 or 30 years. I included a figure here that shows kind of their where they're dispersed in California. I didn't ask location-based question. However, I did have zip codes from the database. So I was able to create this map showing where the LTOs are located. So you can see most of them are located in the north, and there's a pretty good portion that are on the coastal ranges and the south. I also want to note that 52 LTOs from that list weren't even in California. These were Nevada or Oregon loggers that held a California LTO license. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. In terms of employment, I'm going to explain this really quickly here. The parentheses are how many individuals actually responded to that question in particular. So when I talk about 432 crews in total for LTOs, that was the 215 people that responded to this question. So they're not all 220, just to keep in mind. So there were 432 crews, averaging about 1 crew per operation for almost 80% of the operations targeted. And you can see here on this chart that it's skewed to the right, meaning a lot of these values are on this lower side. In terms of employees, there was about 900 employees for these LTOs in the state of California, averaging 5 employees per crew. I do want to note that even though the average says 5 employees, almost 50% of responses were between 1 and 3 crews. Again, you can kind of see that by the shape of this graph. Employee age, this answer provided some age categories or groupings, and most employees were between 25 to 50 years old on average. I also included on my presentation a little asterisk next to the interview questions I asked, which didn't go to all 220 LTOs. And so I asked how easy it was for these interviewees to find new employees. And most of them said it was very hard. And this was because they were having difficulties finding skilled operators. There was low interest in joining the industry as a whole, and there were just general issues with the economy. In terms of employment, diving a little bit deeper, I wanted to see if the age of an LTO has any correlation with the age of their employees. So I created a hypothesis around that and tested it using Pearson's correlation test. This came back as significant, meaning there is some sort of correlation here. To go one step further, I wanted to create like how likely is it for you to get hired or for someone to get hired under your LTO license? And so I went through with an ordinal logistic regression using probabilities of group membership, and it showed me this really fun figure here that basically you can follow along the x-axis as an LTO and see maybe what you're more likely to, who you're more likely to hire, or you can follow the y-axis or your age group specifically and see which LTO may be more likely to hire you. So this model did come back accurate to the data, and most age groups were statistically significant predictors of hire for LTOs, except for the 18 to 24-year-old age group, which wasn't a significant predictor of hire. I wish I could get this thing to stop jumping, but I don't know how to. So yeah, I thought this was pretty interesting. I do want to say that although this graph is really informative, that this doesn't promise anyone certain hiring probabilities moving forward. It's just something to look at, these LTOs that responded in particular. Moving on to equipment, before we dive too much into this, I want to explain the difference between machines and equipment for this research. So I separated these two into different groups. Machines, just including like the heavy machinery, what I was talking about with mechanization, in terms of like the grapple skidder, processor, feller buncher. I'm going to keep using those as an example. But equipment included that, as well as chainsaws and trucking, which chainsaws, there was a whole bunch of them. So it kind of threw some numbers off, which is why we separated it. And then trucking wasn't a sole kind of focus of this study. It was like a little side project that we wanted to look at. So because of this, we wanted to differentiate these two terms. So in general, there are about 5,500 pieces of equipment for all LTOs that responded to this. If we remove the chainsaws, it drops it down to about 1,500. So as you can see there's a lot of chainsaws out there, and they were kind of messing around with the data a little bit. On average, each crew has about 20 and a half pieces of equipment. The condition is here on this chart. Most of the equipment was in fairly good condition. It seems the loggers are taking good care of their equipment. Skidding and loading did have the most responses of bad or very bad. Still pretty minimal if you'd ask me. But this may just be because of how much use they're getting, or maybe just like a little bit more heavy, and yeah, they just may be kind of getting a little bit more action, I guess. So each one of these processes here, felling, skidding, processing, loading, and chipping or biomass, can be included in a logging operation. It's kind of sequential up until the chipping or biomass, which is an optional thing if they are looking at fuel reduction, or just want to get rid of some of that woody debris on the landscape. But I said, well, what's a full system? I'm going to include every one of these categories. If they have at least one piece of equipment in each category, they're going to have this quote unquote full system. And so I found that about 32% of loggers or LTOs had this full system. Removing chipping on biomass, that included an extra 14%. So there are quite a few loggers out there that have these capabilities and have this diversity. In terms of trucking, there are about 1,500 pieces of trucking equipment that were registered for this survey. Majority of these responses, or the highest frequency of responses, came from chip trucks, log loggers, and water trucks. And then another interview question here, I asked interviewees how easy it was for them to be buying equipment, or even just maintaining their equipment. And they said that generally they look towards buying equipment to either maintain job security, or if a job requires something that they don't have. And some of them even said that they were looking at different incentive programs, such as the Carl Moyer program, which provides funds to different companies, private and public, in order to create cleaner air equipment through the California Air Resources Board. So some other implications or incentives included tax implications, price reductions, lowered interest rates for these equipment, and faster rate of payments from their contracts. So I wanted to show you a little bit about the total, all of the machines here. So this is a table that includes the average amount of machines per operation, the average age of these machines, and then the total quantity overall. And so this is something that's included in my report. I don't want to dive too deeply on here for time. But just to give you some time to look at it, I'll tell you about another interview question that I included, which was how much a logger would budget for their equipment, whether this means buying new equipment or maintaining their equipment as is. And so they ranged between $50,000 to $1 million a year, on average around the $500,000 mark. Some LTOs provided, like, they cut out a percent of their operating costs and use that for budgeting. And some loggers just didn't even use any budgeting at all. They just kind of flew by the seat of their pants and saw what took them where, which I thought was pretty interesting for my planning mind, but to each their own. So production, we're going to be moving from equipment to production now. Production, I'm going to be talking about it in terms of 1,000 board feet, or MBF. This is a unit for production. On my survey, I included several different units and converted them all into MBF so I could compare them. But I found that on average, or the range for production, annual production for LTOs, was between 0 and 140,000 MBF, or 1,000 board feet. The ones that answered 0 for any of these questions, whether it be these ones or employment questions, what doesn't necessarily mean they're not doing anything or they don't have employees, but maybe they are not looking at actual production. They're working off of acreage, or for Christmas trees, linear feet or something like that. So averaging on for each LTO about 2,000 MBF per year. And so in total, for all of the LTOs that answered this question, I found that there were 901.5 MMBF, which is million board feet. And so to compare this as close as we can to other capacity, I looked at mill capacity from 2016, which estimated about 1,870 MMBF, so that's the million board feet, in Scribner. To give you a little insight on Scribner, this is just a conversion factors that the mills use in order to, it's, you know, what you put into a mill isn't exactly what you're going to take out of it. So I can't compare them because it's not just in plain MMBF, but you can kind of look a little bit and draw some parallels there if you'd like. I just can't make any promises. In terms of daily targets for production, they range between 0.04 and 2,000 MBF each day. This is basically me saying, hey, like, if you were having a perfect day, where would you be for production? And on average, LTOs were saying it's about 30 MBF. I also asked LTOs how their productions changed this last year compared to historic averages for their company. And about 40% said that their production has decreased, 35-ish said that it stayed the same, bless you, and then 23% said that their productions increased over the last year. I included a table here with some information on timberland ownership, as well as different types of works that LTOs can conduct. So the main ownership groups or for timberland were industrial, non-industrial, and federal timberland. In terms of types of work, it was mainly commercial, fuel reduction, and restoration. And I also allowed them to write in an other response, which a lot of these talked about salvage logging. And so this table indicates 0% of operations. So basically, if they don't work on it at all. So for example, about 42% of these LTOs don't work on industrial timberland at all. The 1 to 99% says that they're doing some sort of like they're doing some industrial, some non-industrial, some sort of combination of different ones. And then 100% is they're just solely focusing on, you know, industrial timberland, for my example, to continue on with it. So I do want to note some highlights that only 5% of LTOs are focusing 100% on federal timberland. There's much higher percentages for industrial and non-industrial, and federal is really not being focused on a lot by these LTOs solely. Additionally, restoration, as you can see, there's only about 1% of LTOs that focus solely on restoration. I think it's important to note that a lot of the other percentages comes from either some sort of combination or the commercial fuel reduction. And then another interview question I asked was how to make working with the federal government more enticing for these LTOs. 5 interviewees said that they're just not interested at all. Some of the reasons behind it is that they feel that the federal timberland is overregulated. There was litigation on sales. They felt their innovation was being killed working with the federal government, and they just felt like there was too much micromanagement. There was one LTO, though, who really loved the federal government, and they were super into it, and they said that they appreciated that there were clear lines in the sand, meaning that they knew when they were overstepping or when they were within the boundaries of what the federal government would allow. They also appreciated that the federal government was very transparent with them. They even said that once you get a handle of the paperwork side, you just kind of can streamline it, not reinvent the wheel, and it's pretty easy to move forward with them. And then also they really enjoyed that after they finished bidding on a contract, whether or not they got it or didn't, the federal government would give them a debriefing and explain why they made a decision. So statistical testing. I have to prove I'm a grad student and I'm looking at statistics. So I went ahead and created a few hypotheses. The first one being that the number of logging crews will have a positive correlation with annual production. Thinking if there's more, then there's more. That's my thought process. I had a very similar hypothesis I'm going to talk about at the same time, which was that logging crews would also have this positive correlation with total machines. And I found that through Spearman's correlation tests for both of these that there was a significant relationship indicating that it's positive, that there is an increase for annual production with an increase in either the number of logging crews and then logging crews to machines. Cool. And so I included a table here. This is what my descriptives look like that kind of led me to wanting to dive a little bit deeper. So you can see there's kind of a trend that you might be able to identify. And that's what I was looking at to then pull for hypothesis testing in the future. Created a few more hypotheses. The first one being that the type of work an LTO conducts is correlated with their annual production. My initial thought behind this was commercial-focused LTOs would probably be a little bit more focused on their production, while fuel reduction and restoration may not have that as one of their management objectives. After I went through with the Kruskal-Wallis non-parametric test, I found that this wasn't significant, which mainly means that no matter what work an LTO is doing, it's not going to impact their production or annual production. There may be some other factor that is making this impact, or maybe there's nothing happening at all. I also thought that the average number of employees per crew would be correlated with daily target for production. This is very similar to on the last slide, one of the hypotheses, and again was found significant. And then lastly, I wanted to look at the time an LTO spends in the industry and see if that was correlated with their annual production in terms of MBF. I ran a Spearman's correlation on that, and I included a visual here. And as you might be able to tell from the visual, there's nothing really going on. There's no significant relationship or correlation between these two variables. So the last kind of section was the opinions, views, outlooks, that kind of thing. And so I provided a few options and asked LTOs to rank their highest threats or challenges in their operations. And most responses for the number one ranking or like the highest threat or challenge was for availability of work, which had about almost 30% of LTOs saying that was their number one challenge. Employment followed that, and then health and safety came next. In terms of recommending the industry, I asked these LTOs if they would be willing to recommend it to some old chap on the street or whatever that may be. And only about 50% said yes. 23% said they might or might not, depending on who it was. Over the phone, they were telling me like, well, it depends if I know this person or if I don't know this person and their work ethic. And then a little over 25% said that they just wouldn't recommend the industry at all. This question garnered a few laughs between me and these LTOs because I was like, hey, I'm entering into the industry. I would hope you would want to recommend it, but not all of them had that feeling. I also asked about their vision for the future of the timber industry as a whole. About 48% said that they were optimistic for the future. 29%, almost 30% said that they were neutral. They didn't feel strongly one way or another. And then 19%-ish said that they were pessimistic about the future of the industry. I also asked about their succession planning. So basically, who will take over the business once they retire or pass away? And you can see here that it's pretty diverse. There was a good quantity that didn't have a succession plan and a good quantity that did have a succession plan. There was no real clear trends anywhere that I saw just from this visual that gave me, I guess, any confidence or lack thereof in terms of succession planning, which I thought was really interesting. So to dive a little deeper once again, I came up with the hypothesis that respondents who have a positive outlook on the industry or vision for the future will be more likely to recommend the industry. If they're thinking pessimistic, they may also say yes to recommending it to somebody. And I went ahead and used the Spearman's correlation test and found that this relationship is significant. So if they do have a more positive outlook, they are more likely to hire somebody. I also made a hypothesis that respondents with more employees would be more likely to have a succession plan, thinking they would probably feel a little bit more obligated to plan post-retirement or death for their employees if there was more of them. However, this can only be partially confirmed. I have a few visuals up here showing the average amount of total employees for LTOs and their responses. So you can see that there's 2 employees on average for people that don't have a succession plan, 3 for the people that weren't sure, and then 6 employees for the people that did have a succession plan. So basically, you can see here on this bottom one, but there is a significant difference in the amount of employees between people that do have a succession plan and don't. However, this might or might not isn't statistically different, significantly different enough from either of the 2 answer choices on either end. It's kind of just like this middleman that's just not really different. So to dive into interview results, this is the rest of some of the questions I asked on the interview that I haven't already addressed in this presentation so far. So I asked these loggers, again, there was 9 of them, how easy it was for them to start a logging business or how easy they thought it might be to start a logging business. And most of them said it was hard. This centered around costs, needing to get loans, equipment prices, short-term contracts. So these LTOs aren't contracted for multiple years at a time, although they would like to be. And then experience, mainly in terms of workforce experience, and finding employees that are able to conduct these operations at the level they want to. In terms of compensation satisfaction, most LTOs, again, were pretty satisfied with their compensation, or they felt that they controlled their own destiny. So that's kind of the idea of if you want to make more money, maybe take on more contracts. So it's really dependent on how the operations are run. And one LTO in particular said that although they may be increasing their work by taking some of these like smaller contracts, they will in the end become less effective or efficient, having to deal with all these contracts that are under their belt at one time. In terms of health changes, I asked LTOs how their health changed in the industry, not related to aging, so taking that out. And most of them, or a good portion of them, said that their health has increased since entering into the industry, and this largely had to do with feeling more energetic because the work is more physically demanding. So if they're out there in the woods, running through the woods, setting chokers or hooking chokers, then they're on their feet a bit more. The LTOs that said that their health had decreased over the time said it mainly had to do with like a transition to desk work where there was added stress and being in the same position throughout the whole day. Insurance was another topic that I discussed a little bit, maybe a little bit more controversial for some people. I do want to note that insurance has a lot of different factors that influence the rates. And one of these things has to do with safety, which I'll address next. But insurance basically ranged between $3,500 a year to $75,000 a year for these 9 LTOs. I do want to say a quick fact that at the Associated California Logger meeting where I presented some of these findings, some of the LTOs thought this was blasphemy and that it should be much higher. But this is what the LTOs presented, so this is what I'm going to share with you. In terms of safety, set rules, a culture around safety, physical items just such as job hazard analyses, and regular safety meetings were ways that these LTOs were implementing their safety plans. By becoming an LTO, especially with the A, you need to have a safety plan in place. And so this is just how they're making sure that their workers or employees are being safe on the job. I talked previously about the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I talked about a little bit of them in the survey, but I really dove deep with these interview respondents. Some strengths were knowledge or experience of the workforce, variability in what they can do, and their quality of work. Keeping on the lighter side, the opportunities they were looking forward to was different work or contract types that they were encouraged by in the future, they were planning on applying to, as well as purchasing of new equipment. And some of them were excited, or one of them was excited about a new exportation opportunity to export lower value logs. In terms of weaknesses, the weaknesses identified came from workforce, specifically like workforce experience. A cost was a weakness, pricing of equipment or operating costs. Also, some LTOs thought that being small was a disadvantage for them. And maybe if they were a bit of a larger operation, it might help, but right now they identify that as a weakness. In terms of threats, some of the limitations I addressed in terms of the California Forest Practice Rules and regulations, protections around endangered species, that created some threats to their operations in terms of they didn't know if an animal or plant would be identified in their area and operations would have to stop. Risk was also a threat identified, such as the risk of fire. It's always a risk that we have to deal with at this point. And then also outside forces such as inclement weather that may impact their operations. So I'm going to dive a little bit into the limitations of this study and hopefully where it can be elevated moving forward. My survey tool was targeted towards larger operations. So these smaller LTOs were either calling me up saying this doesn't make any sense to me, I'm too small for this, or I'd had to encourage them to keep continuing on with the survey tool, or they just weren't feeling like they could answer the survey at all. My survey tool also lacked the location data, so I did have to create that figure earlier with the state of California and general locations, but that's not entirely accurate. So I'd encourage looking at location data in the future. I also included too many options for people to write in other, and some of them were very similar to options they could have just chosen, but to each their own. It was making data analysis a little bit more tricky because I didn't want to interpret what they might have been saying and interpret it wrong. In terms of the implementation, I only had, I think, about 200-ish email addresses for the 894 LTOs. I was really hoping to use email to contact all of them, but I had to be a big girl and make a lot of phone calls instead, which ended up being just fine. Also, the Caltrees list database for LTOs doesn't include any C license holders. And so I got 2 of them. I'm not quite sure where they came from, but I'm sure glad they answered the survey. But that might be something to look forward to in the future, is potentially being able to be a little bit broader and include these individuals that hold the C license, or maybe the intentions of this future survey tool may not want to look at these small, very small operations. Additional implementation limitations includes that a lot of these loggers were completing them on their own, which means they didn't have time to ask me questions if they weren't clear about certain questions or subjects, which could kind of create, well, it did create some issues in terms of their annual production figures were extremely high in some cases. So working on your own kind of gives you this opportunity to implement a few accidents. Also, the number of LTOs fluctuates so much. New LTOs are coming on continuously. I think around like 200 to 300 LTOs are applying each year. Generally, that number is going up, but Cal Fire, I tried asking them and pestering them. They don't have a list of what the number of LTOs and how they've changed over time. They just have these new applicants. And so this study is a snapshot of the January 20th, 2024 LTOs and may not be accurate to the LTOs that are out there at this time. Additional limitations around the analysis is that differentiation between equipment and machines. I had to separate them, but it kind of created some confusion in my analysis. So that was just a little stick point. Also, I don't really see it as a limitation, but I guess it kind of was for my study. But there was just so much data to weed through and to look at. And I wanted to dive a lot deeper, but I just didn't really have the time for this study period. So I would really look forward to kind of seeing a little bit more happening in the future with a similar study. And then for the interviews, I made a big mistake and I didn't record audio for them. So I don't have direct quotes for my interviewees. I was able to type and write down their responses as accurately as possible. I have a few direct quotes, but largely is summarizing what they were stating to me at the time. So what now? What can we do moving forward with this research or with the knowledge of this research? Well, I would recommend repeating a very similar study regularly, of course, taking my limitations and correcting them so it's even better every time. Having regular surveys of the workforce may lead to a greater understanding of not just a singular snapshot, but of how the industry is changing or how the workforce is changing over the years. Also, finding ways to raise LTO satisfaction. 50% saying that they would recommend the industry kind of seemed very small to me. 1 out of 2 loggers would recommend the industry to me. So I think finding some way to study how to raise this LTO satisfaction in terms of their work may be beneficial to the industry as a whole moving forward. And then also addressing these cohorts and age groupings that I showed you in that figure with the different lines and age groups would be really interesting to see, why some age groups may be more likely to be hired in general and some may not. Also, in terms of logging as a whole in California, figuring out how to get more of these high value employees would be really beneficial. A lot of the loggers were bringing this up as a sticking point. Also being able to fully address supply and demand. I was able to come up with what these surveyed loggers are doing right now, but I can't compare them to any capacity or demand without a similar like unit or figure. And so I couldn't completely answer capacity. I could just answer what we were seeing from these loggers. And then also looking at the broader workforce, I was just looking at LTOs, but these LTOs obviously have a lot of employees. So if someone wanted to go deep down the rabbit hole, they could look at all of these employees among the LTOs. And then lastly, for the timber industry as a whole, outside of logging, the industry has a lot of these integral moving parts that aren't just the workforce. It also includes the timberland ownership, mills, export facilities, and consumer demands. Additionally, there have been a few wildfires in California in the past, so those impacts on the workforce may be interesting to look at in the future, whether or not it's negatively impacting people, such as if they're focusing on commercial timber harvest, or positively impacting people, such as these fuel reduction crews. And then also the CARB restrictions. California Air Resources Board has been pushing towards more clean air vehicles and equipment, which may impact these heavy machineries. And I know it's already impacting some chainsaws and other type of equipment in California. But the impacts of that and how they may trickle down in the future would be interesting to look at. I do want to do a few acknowledgments before I move on to questions. I'd like to thank my advisors, Hunter, Erin, and Matt. Mathew, thank you so much for being there along the way. In terms of groups, I appreciate the U.S. Forest Service for financing and supporting this study through Mathew. And then also California Center for Rural Policy. I have Nick right here who helped me a lot along the way in terms of figuring out what's going on with my data. Also to the Associated California Loggers for providing me opportunities to speak publicly and some email addresses. Whoop. And then the licensed timber operators for all the laughs, sweet words, and some tears that were happening along the way. And lastly, I'd like to thank my family, which includes the logging sports team, for their continued support, making sure that I'm coming through this alive on the other side. As well as my mom and dad and my fiance Gannon for all of their support and listening to my rambling as this study happened. So yeah, thank you very much for being a part of this presentation and being able to listen about logging and the workforce here in California. And I think questions now.
Yeah, and could you just remind Matt online to save his questions until the end?
Yeah, I don't know if you heard that, Matt, but we'll save your questions until the end.
And maybe just so that people online can hear, you might have to repeat the questions from the audience here,
Okay.
just so they can understand what the question is.
Yeah, and if you're on Zoom, you can either use the raise hand function, or you're welcome to put anything into the chat, and I'll try to figure out how to do that.
Okay, but yeah, otherwise we'll open it up for questions. Big round of applause. You have any questions?
What's up, Julie?
Solid job, Kendra.
Thank you.
What was your favorite part of the entire project?
My favorite part of the entire project, I would have to say, is being able to speak to these loggers one-on-one. There were a lot of really positive recommendations from them. And I'd also say that I was just able to kind of form these, hour-long relationships with these loggers, in which I was able to dive a little bit deeper about their history in logging, which was really cool. As well as, they just gave me some really kind of out there advice in life that I thought was really cool. But coming from loggers who are generally like this like angry, scary bunch, or at least perceived to be, it was really nice to get kind of their sweeter side. So yeah, that was my favorite part. Yes, Connor.
Great work. I was fortunate to see you present at the ACL, so I had a sneak preview into this, and thought it was great both times. There was a lot of effort. Good results. There's a lot there. So I do have a few questions, but I'll maybe just take on to
Okay.
I guess, one of the things, maybe the first bigger picture question, maybe two of them. One is when you responded to the neighborhood surveys,
Mhm.
who were they? Were they typically owners, representatives, and how did they answer those questions, particularly around some of the questions related to their experience of their time? Were they answering as representative of company, themselves personally, the LTO license? And maybe an example of that could be someone that purchases a company with 2 years of experience in the industry and purchased an established 50-year. So I guess, was there any thought or kind of control for their perspective of how they answer?
Definitely, yeah. So Connor was asking if you guys couldn't hear of Zoom in terms of like who the respondents were in their operations, and also in terms of experience, where that came from, if it was personal experience or experience from the company, if that's correct.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that a lot of the LTOs, just from recalling my phone calls with them, they seem to be either company owners for their individual companies, or they were, I guess, like their sole person. Like they didn't have a company name per se. It was just a name on the database. And so I did really encourage that in terms of demographics, years in the industry, that they talked about themselves personally. Some of these surveys were responded by LTO's wives, who were honestly a great point of contact for this survey. And I did encourage them to be answering it from the perspective of the registered LTO and not per se their perspective. So just to kind of separate that. I would say that there were limited individuals that were LTOs within like a larger company. Like for example, Green Diamond, of course, you have your LTOs under the Green Diamond title. There was like I think an FFA group that had an LTO license. So there were a few of those sprinkled in. However, most of them seem to be either company owners, and a lot of them were like contracted onto timberland, not owning their own land. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another one or should I wait?
Yeah, you can ask another one. Fire away.
Well, this is very a lot of variables on this information. One of the things I noticed was that this was very logging timber harvest centric process, but we have a lot of LTOs that either are arborists, are roads primarily, types of work, or other things, timber fallers that really single function within that. And even trucks are an example where you don't need a license, but some big trucks. So did you, I guess, how did you consider those different functions? That sort of, I guess that you're pulling data from a larger group and you're focusing on a subset of that. How did you sort of control for that for your process and analysis?
Definitely, yeah, that was definitely a hard part as I was working through it. When I originally created the survey tool, I didn't realize just how diverse LTOs were and the work that they completed. So it was a little bit of learn as you go kind of process for me. For example, there was one individual who was primarily towards Christmas trees, and he gave me as much information as he could, but there were definitely some questions that he had to skip. But he answered as many as possible. He also provided me with linear feet as a unit of measure, which wasn't something that it wasn't one of like the main units that I was able to convert back. So that was kind of more of like, oh, that's really interesting to know about, but maybe not something that I included in my analyses. Kind of a similar one is there was this one response that was clear they were kind of into like arboriculture. In fact, they had a comment that they were an arborist company. And that one had, I think, like 300 employees within that singular LTO license. Because they were such an outlier, I did decide to extract them from the analysis, mainly because of that, and it was just them and their chainsaws, but also because their intentions and their management plans weren't exactly like the other like more logging intensive ones. And that's why I would encourage moving forward to create a survey tool that is more applicable to the diversity of LTOs, because I do agree this was really focused on logging in particular. But yeah, I hope that helps. There were some people that just had chainsaws, and so all they answered was chainsaws, a few for processing, a few for felling, but they weren't able to answer a lot more of those questions. I would say generally they were able to answer at least hopefully half or more questions. So they were pretty broad in some cases.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good work.
Okay.
Do you want to ask if there are any questions online, just to give those people a chance?
Yeah, I have one. Okay, let's see. Any sense of the number of LTOs moving into the future? Are the numbers going up or remaining static, increasing or decreasing? So I don't quite know exactly where we're at in terms of like the total number. However, based off of the Cal Fire estimates in terms of the applicants, it came from, I think, I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but about 4 or 5 years ago, there was about 200, 250 LTOs that were, or people that were applying for the LTO license. And currently we're over 300. So what I would say from estimates from this study and talking with Cal Fire, that it looks like it's increasing. I also know that there is this kind of shifting of focus in terms of more restoration fuel reduction projects that would potentially increase the desire to get an LTO license, as well as there's like an agreement between the state of California and the federal government to be harvesting like a certain number of acres. I don't know if you know off the top of your head, Hunter, but it was like 5 million additional acres.
2 million.
2 million?
Yeah.
2 million additional acres. So this gives opportunities for people that are interested in getting their LTO license to maybe have this work. So I'm hoping it's moving in towards an increase in LTOs, but this might be something that would be interesting for these further studies that are similar to really be able to track that. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes,
Well done, Kendra.
thank you.
So at the federal level, there's been a big push to increase logging on federal lands while simultaneously decreasing the workforce and funding at the federal level. So I guess my question is, and you touched on this a little bit in your research, like only 5% of LTOs are operating on federal land. So what are like the biggest obstacles from your research on increasing that number or providing more incentives?
Definitely, yeah. I printed out some of my interview responses here that I can touch on a little bit because that was an interview question. But they really did identify quite a few areas that were like sticking points for them or struggles that may be able to be remedied in the future by the federal government to ease it a little bit. But some of the opportunities they were talking about were like landowner grants. If there are more of these grants towards the landowners for like fuel reduction on their own property, this gives more availability of work to the LTOs. Additionally, let's see, just putting out more jobs and projects. I mean, it's sounding like the federal government is looking at treating more timberland. So hopefully that will increase the amount of projects moving forward. And in terms of like wanting to decrease the workforce but maintain what's happening, that might dip a little bit into the idea of mechanization, where you have less people needed on the landscape, but you can still be doing the same capabilities. So I'd say, like, off the top of my head, I don't have anything clear right now that the Forest Service can do. Instead, I have ideas of where LTOs aren't interested or why they're not interested, that maybe the Forest Service can base reasonings off of moving forward to make changes. That
Thank you.
makes sense. Cool. Okay, we have another one here. Any comments on upcoming prevailing wage changes to vegetative management? So nothing straight comes to mind in terms of that. I can definitely look into it and respond to you, Clark, personally. But we did get a lot of this concern about, I'd say maybe a similarity would be kind of workers' compensation to prevailing wages, just in terms of having like this base rate that needs to be paid. But there were concerns about like these overhead costs towards employment. And so I don't have a specific answer for you in terms of prevailing wage, but I would say that like in terms of looking at these workers that have like these different layers of payment on top of them may not be so enticing to the LTOs that responded to this survey, but it's definitely not stopping some of them. But I can definitely get back to you with a better answer in the future. And you had a second part to that. Project is funded by the Forest Service, but did CAL FIRE express interest in continuing this type of research? So my collaboration with CAL FIRE on this project was pretty limited. I did reach out to CAL FIRE in the beginning, and I asked them if they had any way to distribute the survey tool to all of their LTOs. And they said at this time that wasn't possible, and they weren't able to share any email addresses with me due to confidentiality reasons, I believe. But the CAL FIRE has tried to be helpful with this research, and they seemed interested in it. They even encouraged me to attend an LTO class to getting your LTO license, not registered, of course, but just kind of experiencing the people that are interested in getting the license. And they also were able to provide me with those estimates of how many LTOs are trying to, or how many people are trying to become an LTO each year. So they weren't deeply integrated into this project. However, they were kind of on the outside and were interested in helping out where they could, which was limited, but I'll take what I can get. I don't see any more in the chat.
Any further questions? We've
Another
got
one, Connor?
a couple more minutes left for questions before we break.
Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah.
Fire away.
Sorry, that's a very fast thing. The Forest Service, the 100% group that worked with Forest Service was very low, as you noted. You're not required to have a California LTO to work on the Forest Service. Did you find any indication that maybe there's a larger group, or there could be some folks that work exclusively on the Forest Service, but because of that, they may not pursue a California license? Is there any?
Yeah, so
indicators there?
I was actually just thinking about that yesterday or the day before. And that kind of leads into my hope that moving forward we can expand to not just LTOs, because there is that group that Connor was saying, in case the chat or the Zoom couldn't hear. There may be this entire population that works solely on Forest Service land that isn't required to have their California LTO license. So I really am interested in that group. We didn't get to survey them, or I didn't hear from any logger in particular that hinted at that. But that has been on my mind, and I do think that would be really important to look at in the future, just in terms of, if we're looking at California loggers, that also includes loggers that are solely on the federal timberland. That's a very good question, though. Definitely piques my interest.
I'll just chime in, Connor. That was something we did look at prior to the start of the survey, because it was a question of, are we going to miss a whole
part of the population. And we consulted several loggers closer over the Sierras that do contracts for both and have been in the industry for several decades. And their indication was not them or anybody they knew didn't have an LTO license who was doing work on Forest Service land. They said that's kind of gone away in the last 20 years, where even the Forest Service is not requiring officially, but preferring people have their LTO license from a liability and risk perspective. And so their professional opinion was there's probably very few of those people out there that do exist.
Focused on commercial.
Yeah, focused on, well, and just to keep their doors open too, because with the demise of a lot of those Forest Service mills in the last 30 years, they had to get an LTO license just to be able to find work sometimes and balance out their workload.
The last one,
Okay,
sorry, promise.
hit me with it.
You went to the softball, so.
Oh, I can do more softball questions.
You know, I kind of the time in the industry versus production question would be very interesting. There are a lot of variables in there, I think, so I guess specifically when you put that data together and you looked at time in industry, you get a 10-year cutoff. As what you're looking at in the paper, and these exact years individually. Did you control for harvest method, like say contractors that have yarder versus tractor side? You control for the primary silviculture method, location, or even task functions to sort of make sure that you're looking apples to apples, or did you really just focus purely on amount of time in the industry and production of that?
That's a really good point. I didn't focus on that. I really just looked from the top-down view of the general time and industry against their production. I think that would be really interesting and might produce some different results if it was separated by like the type of work or maybe even timberland. But I didn't discuss it exactly in here, but I did try to look at kind of the first 10 years to see if there was any difference in the first 10 years versus the remainder 11 plus years. Just to see if maybe people were a bit more rip-roaring ready to go in the first few years or more rip-roaring ready to go in the last 11 plus however many years it is. But there was nothing significant there either. And so like generally I didn't differentiate specifically to that. I think that would be really interesting moving forward. But yeah, there's nothing happening so far in terms of just years and just production on the annual.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Gannon has one.
So when you were looking at like the people's perspectives on optimism for the future of the industry or pessimism, did you happen to notice any trends with their outlooks depending on age, like people who are just starting up at between ages of 20 and 30 and people who might be exiting the industry, but they're you notice any trends between, if they're optimistic early?
So I can actually, it might have cut off. There were quite a few hypotheses. I think I created for each variable or each question, I created at least 2 different hypotheses to look at descriptives for. So I definitely could have looked at that, and I can look it up for certain if you want an answer right now, or I can respond it to you later. But I do think that was one of the ones I looked at, and if I hadn't addressed it, that means there was nothing clear happening there.
What was the question again?
In terms of the years in the industry, or was it outlook and then age?
Yeah.
Yeah, so outlook on the industry, optimistic, pessimistic, or neutral, depending on age. It's going to take me too long to look it up. But I can get back to you on that and to whether or not there was anything happening. But if I didn't see anything happening, that sounds like one of the hypotheses I would have looked at. I didn't include it in my statistical testing. Yeah, the age was kind of like, I don't know, age and years in industry were kind of interesting because it was very much like the average really tended to be around the 50 for like everything. So it could have been another one of those where there's no clear steps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any further questions, I think we'll wrap it up there. So let's give a big round of applause to Kendra. Nice job presenting. So I'll just say a few words. Thanks everybody online who attended. Wish you could have been here in person, but thanks for coming and asking Kendra questions. And of course, you can follow up with her contact details. We're going to end officially the presentation here. So thank you everybody. And thank you Kendra for sharing with us. We're going to dismiss the general public, and her thesis advisors are going to have their own internal defense questions now. But thank you very much. We'll see you later. Mathew, please stay on the line.
I'm gonna take a short break. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Congrats. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for all your help.
Thanks a lot, Nick.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.